Check, check. This working? Check, check. Okay, there we go. You got to do that. Well, good morning, Louisville. Those of you from Louisville, I don't know if you are aware of this, but this is where Muhammad Ali was from. Glad you got that, because I've been told like 30 times since I got here yesterday that this is where Muhammad Ali was from. Greatest heavyweight in history. I was more of a Joe Frazier and George Foreman fan, but wow, awesome dude. Actually, should be talking about that at some point. Muhammad Ali, phenomenal boxer, always the smartest person in the ring, greatest trash talker in boxing history. But when it came to choosing his next move religiously, didn't always make the best decisions. And if you look back at the 60s, back then it would have been very difficult to make a well-informed decision about Islam, because the main sources on the life of Muhammad and history of Islam weren't even available in English yet. And so this allowed people to come in, and Muslim preachers to come in and say pretty much anything they wanted about Islam. And they were able to popularize that a lot in the 60s. That situation has changed. We now have open access to tons of material about Muhammad and the history of Islam. And so this is actually a really great time for people who are interested in reaching Muslims with the gospel. There is not a better time in history to reach Muslims with the gospel than the time we have right now. 14 centuries of Christians who have been interacting with Muslims couldn't have dreamed of the opportunities that we have right now to reach Muslims. Just because, for 14 centuries, if you wanted to share the gospel with a Muslim, you would have to go to a country in the Middle East, and if you were at all successful in reaching people with the gospel, you were probably going to get your head chopped off. Whereas now, gosh, anyone in this room can pick up a phone and talk to a Muslim in Saudi Arabia on Facebook, right? They couldn't have dreamed of these kinds of opportunities. So awesome time. But whether you know any Muslims or plan on talking to any Muslims, I believe it's very important for the church as a whole to learn some basic information about a faith that has about 1.6 billion adherents and is also, according to many sources, the fastest growing religion in the world. So in apologetics, there's just an overwhelming urge for people who get involved in apologetics to start going and dealing with atheism. But atheists are much smaller percentage of the global population than certain other positions. So good for the church to really learn to deal with Islam. Now, I can't really start off a first presentation on Islam without saying a few words about how I became interested in Islam. So for those of you Nabil Qureshi fans, we'll talk for a few minutes about Nabil. I met Nabil in a hotel room on a school trip. We were sharing a hotel room, and I knew that his name was Nabil, and that his family background was from Pakistan. It didn't tell me a lot about how sincerely he held to Islam. But I was in the hotel room, and I was over there reading my Bible in a year, and saw Nabil putting away his prayer rug. So that told me that he was at least serious enough about Islam to bring a prayer rug on a school trip. And so I was over there reading, but I was also praying and said, God, I don't want people to call me a bigot or something like that for starting an argument with this guy. So if you want us to have a discussion, please let him start this discussion. And shortly after that, Nabil said, "So, are you a hardcore Christian?" And I said, "Yes, I am," and that got us started. And so, obviously you can watch Nabil's testimony video or read his book if you haven't already to get his story. But basically, we spent about 4 years studying Christianity and Islam, trying to get to the bottom of which is true. And it was great to actually be friends when we were having those discussions, because lots of times, and this has been getting worse in recent years, but if you have any disagreement on any political issue or moral issue or religious issue, you just have to try and destroy each other and destroy each other's lives. And we understood that I understood that when he's talking, he's telling me I'm wrong about Jesus and I'm wrong about the Bible and so on. I understood, hey, it's not because we're enemies here. He has my best interest at heart. And he understood that when I was talking about Muhammad or the Quran, it's not because I hate him and want him to die or something like that. It's because I want what's best for him. And so we had that awesome friendship. And so this went on for about 4 years. For about the first 2.5, we focused primarily on studying the foundations of Christianity. And then after that, I said, hey, if we're going to apply this level of criticism and scrutiny to my beliefs, we need to be doing the same thing with Muhammad and the Quran. So we ended up dealing a lot with the Muslim sources. Nabil, of course, as probably almost everyone in here knows, eventually became a Christian and was baptized here. And there's me in the background thinking, cool, I'm done with Islam. Because the only reason I was studying Islam was that my best friend was a Muslim. If he had been a Buddhist or anything else, I would have been studying that. It's a good practice to get into, by the way, right? If you meet someone and you become friends with someone and that person has a completely different worldview, as Christians who believe that God is sovereign, you might want to start thinking, hey, maybe I'm here for a reason. So maybe I am the right person to talk to that person. And so it was actually watching Nabil and the stand that he took for Christianity after converting that made me eventually realize, wow, Muslims make really cool Christians. So maybe it's actually a good ministry to stick with. But there's actually a reason that Muslims make cool Christians. See, I grew up as an atheist and I became a Christian, and I told my family I'd become a Christian. I could have told them that I was becoming a Martian Buddhist. They wouldn't have cared as long as I was being good. Right? As long as I was staying out of trouble, that's really what mattered. So lots of us, even from Christian households, if a child goes off and goes off to college or something like that and comes back as an atheist, there will probably be some tension in the house, but it's not like no one's going to die as a result of that. But in Islam, turns out they take that much, much, much more seriously. And basically what you have is Muslims have kind of 3 massive obstacles in front of them that most people in the West do not face. One is most Muslims understand that if they leave Islam, that is either going to completely destroy and sever their relationship with their family, or at the very least that the relationship is going to be very strained from that point on. And I don't just mean with mom and dad, I mean cousins, uncles, aunts, and so on. I've heard from tons of former Muslims who said when they told their family that they had left Islam, it was, we don't want to see you again until you come back to Islam. And said, I haven't seen my mother and father since then. Fortunately for Nabil, he was able to continue a relationship with his family, but was very, very strained. So Muslims generally understand this, that if they make that decision, they're destroying a lot of relationships. So there's that. There's also the issue that according to Muhammad, if anyone leaves, this is a direct quotation from Muhammad, if anyone leaves his Islamic religion, kill him. That's Sahih al-Bukhari. And so according to Muhammad, if someone leaves, you're supposed to kill him. Doesn't happen a lot in the West, but that is the official Islamic penalty for leaving Islam. And so as a convert, it's always in your head, what happens if someone eventually decides to carry out what Muhammad said against me? The third problem or obstacle is that Muslims are told from the day they're born that the worst possible sin is the sin of shirk in Islam. That's associating a partner with Allah. So if you say Jesus is Lord, you've just committed the worst possible sin in Islam. That is a one-way ticket to hell. So this is the Islamic mindset when we preach the gospel. Christians preach the gospel, the good news. And what a Muslim hears when we preach it is, okay, so you want me to believe this thing, which is going to ruin my relationship with my family, possibly get my head chopped off, and then I'll spend eternity in hell. You guys call this good news? Because it sounds more like worst news ever, right? So that makes it very difficult to reach certain Muslims with the gospel. But there's the flip side, right? There's the positive side. The positive side is once a Muslim says, I may have to give up my family and I may get killed. And I've been told all my life that this will get me sent to hell. But you know what? I don't care because I want to know Jesus. That's someone who will lay down his life for Jesus, right? And that's why they make really awesome Christians. And so, anyway, ended up sticking with Islam. And as far as the church is concerned, I believe if the church right now actually learns the basics of Islam, learns the basics of apologetics dealing with Islam, I believe we are going to see more Muslims come to Christ in our generation than all prior generations combined. That's how open the field is for harvest right now. All right, so with that in mind, we are going to cover some topics here. We'll get into this more later, but we're just going to cover the basics. I'm going to assume no one in here knows anything about Islam, so we can start from the ground up, just the basics. So we'll be looking at some basic definitions, just in case any of these terms aren't clear. We'll look at what Islam teaches about God, what Islam teaches about Jesus, what Islam teaches about Christians, what Islam teaches about the Quran, what Islam teaches about Muhammad, and finally some common Muslim arguments for Islam. I see some people scrambling to write all this down. I don't know if there's a way to get it to everyone, but if the church wants to send this out to anyone, people can have the PowerPoint instead of trying to write down all the references and so on. But also, you kind of don't need everything here, all the references and so on. I will draw your attention to things that are actually really, really important and that Christians absolutely must know. All right, so some basic definitions here. Islam is an Arabic word for submission. You can learn a lot about a religion by the name of the religion. So Christianity emphasizes the significance of Christ in Christianity. Islam means submission, so that emphasizes that the heart of Islam is submitting or surrendering to God in Islam. A Muslim or Muslimah for a woman, it's derived from the same word, but this means one who submits. So Islam is the religion or the ideology. Muslim or Muslimah is the person. And so Muslim is one who submits. Allah is just an Arabic word for the God of Islam. It's apparently a contraction of al, which is the definite article, al, and ilah, which means God. So it just means the God. Apparently it's a contraction for the God, but now used as a name. Muhammad is, according to Islam, the final prophet and messenger. So according to Islam, all other nations had their prophets. So thousands and thousands of prophets were sent to different parts of the world. The Arabs, according to Islam, were the last people to get their prophet. And so once Muhammad had been sent, well, everyone had their prophet already. And so Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. He's the final prophet. The Quran, this is the Quran. The word Quran means recitation. It's something that's supposed to be recited. And it's a bit shorter than the New Testament. Much more difficult to read because it's not straightforward like biographical narrative or anything like that. It's kind of, it's out of order. It jumps from topic to topic. But this, according to Islam, it's not like the Bible. This is supposedly the literal and direct speech of Allah. So human writers were not inspired to write this like we believe in Christianity. Allah delivered this to the angel Gabriel. The angel Gabriel delivered it to Muhammad in parts over a period of about 23 years. And Muhammad would recite this to his followers. His followers would jot down what he recited on pieces of bone or leaves and so on, in order that they could memorize and recite it. So there is officially no human component to the Quran. It is the speech of Allah. But in the Quran, Muslims are also told that Muhammad is the pattern of conduct for Muslims and that Muslims have to submit to all of Muhammad's decisions. And so Muslims have more books than just the Quran. They also have what are called the hadith collections. And hadiths are basically, the hadiths are these massive multi-volume collections of stories about Muhammad's teachings and practices. They're usually arranged topically, so you'll have a volume of the hadith that's everything Muhammad said about marriage. And they'll just take all the stories that people remembered about what Muhammad said about marriage and put them together into a section of the hadith. And so Islam isn't simply based on the Quran. In fact, you can't actually be an Orthodox Muslim if you just held to the Quran. Muslims who just hold to the Quran, they say, all I believe in is the Quran, are considered heretics by Orthodox Sunni Muslims. And the reason is some of your most basic Muslim practices do not come from here. They come from something Muhammad said in the hadith. So something as basic as reciting the Shahada, that there's no God but Allah and Muhammad is his messenger. That version of the Shahada, which is how you become a Muslim in the first place, is not found in the Quran. It's found in the Hadith. Praying 5 times per day, that comes from the Hadith, not the Quran. The Quran mentions 3 prayers. And so Islam, as far as what it's grounded in, you have the Quran, but you also have the teachings and example of Muhammad recorded in the Hadith. And those would be the main sources for Islamic belief and practice. So I want to zoom through some of this stuff because I want to still have time to focus on some issues that are a little more important than some others. But what Islam teaches about God, you'll notice that lots of converts to Islam come from a Christian background. And the reason is Islam isn't as strange sounding as something like Buddhism or Hinduism or something like that. There are people who convert to Buddhism and so on. Those are normally people who are attracted to Eastern religions and so on. They have some sort of attraction to that. But Islam can seem very attractive when put in a certain light to Christians who don't have a firm foundation for why they believe what they believe. And you'll see why. Islam has a lot of common ground with Christianity because Muhammad was interacting with both Jews and Christians in Arabia, and we see a lot of overlap. So according to Islam, these would be some parallels here. Allah is all-powerful. Allah is all-knowing and wise. Allah is just and merciful. And Allah created the universe. Now, so far, that sounds an awful lot like the God of the Bible. We're going to see this multiple times. And again, for those of you scrambling to write all these down, you don't need most of these references. Just for stuff like this, just get the main idea. A lot of similarities, a lot of common ground here with Jewish and Christian beliefs about God. But according to Islam, Allah is not a trinity. And if you get a chance, this would be one of the passages to read. If you want to read the Quran, very interesting passage. Chapter 5, verse 116 of the Quran. That's a passage where Allah had been telling Christians not to say 3, not to believe in the Trinity. But in chapter 5, verse 116 of the Quran, we get our first explanation of what the doctrine of the Trinity is. And it's a Trinity made up of Allah, Jesus, and Mary. Now, the Quran is attempting to refute Christian belief in the Trinity made up of Allah, Jesus, and Mary. You see a problem there? Anyone believe that that's what the Trinity is? Great, neither has any other Christian ever, right? So the question is, what is Allah refuting here? Now, here's the thing, right? Muhammad was a 7th century Arab caravan trader. Right? I understand completely a 7th century Arab caravan trader hearing Christians talk about the Trinity and hearing them talk about the Father and the Son and Mary, the mother of Jesus. I understand completely someone like that hearing the word Trinity and then hearing us talk about the Father, the Son, and the mother of Jesus and thinking, oh, that's what they mean by Trinity. That makes sense to me. I can understand Muhammad making that mistake. Very strange to say that that God made that mistake, right? That's a bit more strange. So when Allah is describing what Christians believe with the doctrine of the Trinity, he gets it wrong, which kind of makes I don't know any other way around it. Either Allah doesn't know what Christians believe, in which case he would be ignorant, or he does know what we believe and he's misrepresenting it to make it look silly or something like that. So either way would be a strange view of God. Anyway, again, that's a good reference to know. Allah is a father to no one. And here we don't just mean in a biological sense or something like that. We mean there's no sense in which Allah is a father, not in a spiritual sense. He is not the father he doesn't view human beings as children of God. The highest relationship you can have with Allah, according to the Quran, is a slave to master relationship. We've got some passages there, but the Quran says there is none who comes to him as anything other than a slave. This is actually, I think, related to the next point there, that Allah does not love unbelievers. It's Surah 3, verse 32 of the Quran. So notice, we drew some parallels between Judaism and Christianity on the one hand and Islam on the other. Now we see some differences between what the Bible says and what Islam teaches. So we're told in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says that we should love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us so that we may be like our Father in heaven. So we're supposed to be like God in loving even our enemies. Well, in Islam, Allah just isn't like that. Right? Allah loves you if you first love him. And think about how that is connected to the view that we are all slaves before Allah. If you have a child, hopefully you love that child automatically. If you don't, I would say there's something wrong with you, right? Parents just naturally love their children. You wouldn't naturally love a slave necessarily, right? You would love a slave if it's a really good slave, and if it's a bad slave, well, you wouldn't love that slave at all. But notice, we're all slaves before Allah. So is Allah going to love us? Well, if you're bad, then no, he's not going to love you. He has no love for you. But if you're good, you show that you're a really good, devout slave of Allah, then Allah will love you. And by the way, this affects so much in Islamic theology and Islamic practice that Allah has no love for unbelievers. That a lot of the problems that you've seen in recent years has a lot to do with the Islamic view that Allah does not love those people that we're against. So those are some basic beliefs about God. What Islam teaches about Jesus. Here again, we see a lot of interesting parallels and then some very significant differences. So, according to Islam, Jesus was born of a virgin. That's cool. Who agrees with us that Jesus was born of a virgin? Right? Atheists don't. Right? Most people in the world do not agree with us that Jesus was born of a virgin, but 1.6 billion people do, Muslims. They agree that Jesus performed numerous miracles, including raising the dead, cleansing lepers, and so on. And according to the Quran, Jesus is the Messiah. Once again, who agrees with us that Jesus is the Messiah? Well, Muslims do. And so this is why if a Muslim preacher comes in and says, hey, we believe in Jesus too. We believe in God. We believe in Jesus. We just get rid of some of the confusing stuff in Christianity. And then once you get rid of the confusing stuff that was added to Christianity over time, it's basically Islam. So I say, look what we believe about. Look what we believe about God. Look what we believe about Jesus. It's all the stuff that's right about Christianity. We just get rid of the stuff that's wrong about Christianity. Right? So that's how the invitation goes. So interesting similarities here. But also according to Islam, Jesus didn't die on the cross. This would be another good reference to learn. In fact, if I were to mention like 3 references that Christians in general should learn, Surah 4, verse 157 would be one of them. So Jesus didn't die. He obviously didn't rise from the dead. He was taken to heaven alive. And Jesus certainly wasn't divine, according to Islam. The view on the cross here, the Islamic view of what happened in crucifixion, and there are some differences of interpretation for Muslims, the dominant Muslim interpretation is substitution theory. That someone else was crucified in Jesus' place. Someone else was crucified in Jesus' place. And the most common view among Muslims now is that Judas was crucified instead of Jesus. And this wasn't just, hey, oops, we got the wrong guy. This was Allah. So Allah, according to Islam, miraculously disguised someone else, made him look like Jesus. And then the people who were trying to kill Jesus crucified this other person while Jesus was taken safely to heaven. And again, the most common Muslim view now is that it was Judas. And you can see why on a superficial level this would seem more just to a Muslim, right? Christians are saying that Jesus was wrongfully condemned and crucified. But according to our view, our Muslim view, God disguised Judas, the traitor, made him look like Jesus, and then Judas was the one who was crucified. So it was actually the enemy of Jesus who was crucified. You see how Islam is better. But if you think about that, if you think a little more carefully about that, think about this. Christians believe that Jesus died on the cross. It's one of the foundational pillars of Christianity. According to Islam, why do we believe that Jesus died on the cross? We believe it because Allah did such a great job tricking everyone, right? So, according to Islam, Allah either accidentally or intentionally started the world's largest false religion, Christianity, by tricking everyone into believing that Jesus died by crucifixion, disguising someone else, making this other person look like he was crucified. By the way, side note, notice the complete gospel reversal there, right? In Christianity, the innocent, perfect Jesus is crucified on behalf of guilty sinners. According to your Muslim friends, the guilty, sinful Judas was crucified on behalf of the innocent, perfect Jesus. This complete flip of the gospel. And the rest of this is as well. So notice all of the parallels that we have between Christianity and Islam. But if you look at the three things that are denied about Jesus, you might notice those just happen to be the heart of the Christian gospel. Right? So the disciples spent years with Jesus. In the book of Acts, when they actually go out preaching, you can look at their sermons. They always emphasize Jesus died on the cross for sins. His death was a public event. We are the witnesses that he is risen from the dead, and now we all need to serve him because he is Lord. Right? Death, resurrection, and deity. That's what they preached wherever they went. So that is the heart of the Christian gospel, according to the people who knew Jesus. We're also told false teachers and false prophets are going to come. What are they going to do? They're going to corrupt that message. Muhammad comes along 6 centuries later. Says, hey, you Christians believe in God? So do I. You believe Jesus was born of a virgin? So do I. You believe he lived the most miraculous life in history? So do I. You believe he's the Messiah? So do I. We agree on pretty much everything, except these 3 little things. Didn't die on the cross, didn't rise from the dead, and he's not Lord. If we can get past that, we're good. We're good. The Christian response should have been, wow, we have been expecting you. That is perfect. That is just too perfect of a false prophet. All right, so those are some Islamic views about Jesus. What Islam teaches about Christians. Christians have scripture from God. We'll be looking more at this in the session this afternoon because actually a very important topic, how the Quran views the Christian scriptures. Christians are nearest in friendship to Muslims. My friend Sam Shamoun is back there and he'll flip out if I don't point out the caveat that it's because Christians supposedly break down crying when we hear how wonderful the Quran is. So if you're not like that, this is not talking about you being nearest in friendship. And Christians are compassionate and merciful. So the Islamic view is that we're compassionate and merciful because we are influenced by Jesus and his teachings. But, here's where things get bad. Christians who believe in the deity of Christ are unbelievers. So we're not real believers in the message of Jesus. Christians who are unbelievers are the worst of creatures. 98:6, chapter of the Quran, refers to polytheists, Jews, and Christians as the worst of creatures. And that, once again, is a source of a lot of the problems that we've seen in recent years. Surah 5, verse 51, Muslims must not be friends with Christians or Jews, according to the verse. And Christians are to be fought and subjugated because of their unbelief. And just to be clear, there are plenty of Muslims who reinterpret these passages to mean something else. So when I say that this is Islam, this is what the Quran says. If a Muslim wants to reinterpret that and say, so a Muslim will reinterpret the command to fight those who do not believe, and the command to subjugate Christians, and say, well, this only means Christians who attack you first or something. It doesn't say that. It just says fight these people based on their beliefs. But the point is, if you have a Muslim friend, don't think that he's actually intending to subjugate you or something like that if he's not. Lots of Muslims believe that Islam is a religion of peace and have reinterpreted these passages, but we're talking about what Islam teaches here. And you can look up all these passages and see what they say. There are Qurans available out at the bookstall. What Islam teaches about the Quran. Surah 2, verse 23. The Quran repeats this multiple times. But the main argument that the Quran gives for itself, the main evidence that it offers that it is the Word of God, is what I call the argument from literary excellence. It's just, this is so masterfully written that it must be from God. It couldn't be from anyone else. And the challenge that you have in the Quran is, if you don't believe that this is from God, then just try writing something like it and you'll fail. Now that is it's a strange challenge on multiple levels. Notice one, even if it were true, even if it were completely true, you try, and you can't write something like the Quran. Would that make it from God? No, I don't think so. I mean, I could try all day to write a symphony like Mozart. I'm going to fail, right? I'm going to fail over and over again. You could try to write a play like Romeo and Juliet. You failing does not mean that Romeo and Juliet is the inspired word of God. It doesn't have anything to do with that. But apart from that, there are plenty of people who have written individual chapters, and there's even an entire called the True Furqan, where someone wrote an entire book that parallels the Quran. And that there are people who get up on buses in the Middle East and start reading from the True Furqan, which is like a Christian version of the Quran that's made to sound like the Quran just to meet that challenge. And Muslims will get up and thank the person for reading the Quran to them. And the person just reading this other book. And so, very, very strange challenge. But if you tell all that to a Muslim, unfortunately, Muslims are the official judges of this contest. And so they're going to say, no, you failed. Our experts have examined what you've written, and it is not the same as the Quran. So strange challenge. Notice, you can do that with anything, right? You can say, hey, Jay-Z is the best rapper in the world. He's so great that he has the inspired lyrics of God. And if you don't believe me, try to write something better than him. But Jay-Z's fans are the ones who are going to judge the contest. Well, it's a very strange contest, right? Anyway, but this is the main argument for the authority and inspiration of the Quran. The Quran is free from error and contradiction, and Allah protects the Quran from corruption. What Islam teaches about Muhammad. Islam obviously teaches a lot about Muhammad, but the basic core would be that Muhammad is the pattern of conduct for Muslims. So when we read the hadith, generally the things that Muhammad did are patterns, all the way down to like how he went to the bathroom. These are considered, this is how you should go to the bathroom because this is how Muhammad went to the bathroom. He's your pattern of conduct. Muhammad, again, was the seal of the prophets, so he's the final one. Everyone else had their prophet. Muhammad was the last one. Now every people group in the world had their prophets. And earlier prophets spoke about Muhammad. And 7:157 there, that's an important Quran reference. But 7:157, that talks about Jews and Christians reading about Muhammad in the Torah and the Gospel. So these various teachings become the basis for some of the main arguments that are used for Islam. So there are more than this, but we're just going to cover, look briefly at a couple. We actually kind of already looked at a couple, like the argument from literary excellence and so on. But some of the other main arguments that you'll encounter, the argument from perfect preservation. What I find interesting is that some of the arguments for Islam, they don't come from actually going out and examining the evidence. They come from an assumption or a presupposition. So we mentioned that according to the Quran, Surah 15, verse 9, Allah protects his scriptures from corruption. So one of the most common, if not the most common arguments that I hear on a regular basis from Muslims either have to do with perfect preservation of the Quran or the rapid growth of Islam, right there. But the argument goes that from the time it was revealed to Muhammad, not a single word, not a single letter, not a single diacritical mark in the Quran has ever been changed. It has been perfectly preserved right down to the letter with no variation ever. That's based on the Quran's claim that Allah is going to protect the scripture. What's the problem with that? Well, if you actually read the Muslim sources, they talk about massive changes to the Quran. In Sahih Muslim, one of their most respected sources, Abu Musa, one of Muhammad's companions, talks about 2 entire chapters of the Quran being lost because Muslims didn't recite them enough. Hundreds of verses. Aisha, that was one of Muhammad's wives. Her title is the mother of the faithful in Islam. She talks about more than 100 verses coming up missing from Surah 33 of the Quran. They just couldn't find them all. So you have entire chapters coming up missing, individual large passages coming up missing. You also have individual verses coming up missing. Aisha in Sunan Ibn Majah, 1944, if you want to look it up. According to Aisha, there are these verses that were in the Quran when Muhammad died, and they're not in the Quran today. She mentions 2 specifically. One is the verse of stoning an adulteress. By the way, Aisha was accused of adultery during her lifetime, and so she was under threat of being stoned as an adulteress at some point. And the verse of breastfeeding an adult 10 times. I don't really want to talk about this, but I have to. So, just because people will be wondering, what are you talking about breastfeeding an adult? Well, just so you know, situations would be presented to Muhammad, then Muhammad would ask Allah, and Allah would reveal another part of the Quran that answers this question. Well, one of the situations that arose in early Islam was people would come to Muhammad and say, "Hey, Muhammad, I have to go out of town. I'm a businessman, and my wife has to be around our household servant while I'm gone." And he's a man. "How do I know that they're not going to do something bad while I'm gone? How do I know?" Muhammad sought the wisdom of Allah. And Allah said, "Just have her, your wife, breastfeed this man 10 times. That way he'll be like her son. That way he'll be like her son, and there won't be any sexual attraction." Your reaction is the exact same reaction as everyone else in history, right? But this was the command. This was the command. Grown women had to, in fact, in one of the hadith, Muhammad tells a woman, he says, "Hey, you're going to be around that guy. You need to breastfeed him." She says, "But he has a beard already." He goes, "I know he has a beard." And so Muhammad's listeners saw that there was a problem with this. But this was from Allah. Muhammad's wives did not like this teaching. And so, Sunan Ibn Majah, Muslim source, 1944, Aisha said, because keep in mind, these are not in the Quran. According to Muslim sources, these are Quran. These are in the Quran. What happened to them? Why are they missing? Well, Aisha says, Sunan Ibn Majah, 1944, she says, when Muhammad died, we were busy with preparations for his burial. Aisha had the only copies of these verses, and she said, a tamed sheep came in and ate them. This was the original dog ate my homework excuse, right? Now, think about that. So Because really, probably the most important thing in apologetics dealing with Islam is Muslims are told various things that have no basis in actual evidence or reality. And as long as they go their whole lives without actually ever hearing what the evidence is, they continue to believe these things. That's why 99.9% of the Muslims you will ever meet will tell you that Islam, one of the greatest proofs of Islam is that the Quran has been preserved right down to the letter without a single change anywhere in history. Wait a minute, according to your own sources, Allah couldn't protect the Quran from a sheep. What are you talking about here? That's in your sources. Their leaders don't tell them that, right? Their leaders just tell them perfect preservation, and their leaders will say, and every scholar in the world agrees on this. It's total nonsense. It's totally false. But on the one hand, that is a very sad situation that people are being misled by that and given this false confidence in the Quran and in Islam. The positive side is that allows us to actually learn some responses to this and go share it with our Muslim friends and help them say, wait a minute, maybe I shouldn't be putting all my trust in my imam when he tells me something like this, when it completely contradicts what's in my sources. And so, by the way, you've got the Muslim sources which present the problem with this claim. You can also just line up Quran manuscripts and their entire books that line up manuscripts of the Quran and point out the differences. Another common one, the argument from biblical prophecy. So the claim is that the Bible predicts the coming of Muhammad. Would be very easy to do an entire presentation on something like this. You can find responses to the individual prophecies that are supposedly about Muhammad. I'll give you the most two very quickly. One is Deuteronomy 18:15 or 18:18. Both of those verses mention a prophet like Moses who's going to come after Moses. And so Muslims say, well, Muhammad was the prophet like Moses, because like Moses, Muhammad was both a general and a political leader and a prophet. He was all of these combined. And so that must be about Muhammad. All kinds of problems with that. Sometimes we spend 20 or 30 minutes in our videos going through various problems with that. If you want the simplest one, just skip to the last chapter of Deuteronomy where it explains what prophet like Moses means. And the prophet like Moses, that phrase like Moses refers to the miracles of Moses and to Moses knowing God face to face. And according to Islam, according to the Quran, Muhammad performed no miracles, so not applying to him. And he received his revelations through the angel Gabriel, not from knowing God face to face. So problems there. The other most common one in the New Testament is John chapter 14, verse 16, where Jesus promises that the Comforter will come. And Muslims will say the Comforter is Muhammad. Here again, all you would have to do is actually read the passage and the description of what the Comforter is like, and you'll see that it doesn't fit with Muhammad. If you want something clear, just go 10 verses later where Jesus says the Comforter, the Holy Spirit. Right? So it's talking about the Holy Spirit, not about Muhammad. And finally here, we'll close with this, the argument from rapid growth. You can spend a lot of time having discussions with your Muslim friends about Christianity and about Islam, and you can go through a lot of the arguments for Islam. The case cracker, the clincher for many Muslims is just, well, Islam is the fastest growing religion. This shows that it's true. Once again, that is a very strange argument. I mean, one of the fastest growing movements in history was communism in the 20th century. I don't see what that has to do with communism being true. But apart from that, Muslims tend to think, almost every Muslim who will use this, they won't just say, hey, Islam is growing rapidly. They will say, hey, Islam is growing rapidly. Why would so many people be converting to it if it weren't true? They convert to it because all these people are converting because it makes sense. Well, the problem for that argument is there aren't that many people converting to Islam. Here in the United States, for instance, the number of people converting to Islam is pretty much offset by the number of people leaving Islam. So conversions are not the source of the growth of Islam. The same Pew Research study that claimed that Islam is the fastest growing religion that Muslims appeal to justify this claim, that same study says why Islam is growing rapidly, and it's due to high Muslim birth rates in various countries. And so Muslims have the highest birth rates pretty much everywhere. In Europe, Muslims have higher birth rates than any other group. In other parts of the world, Africa and so on, Muslims have the highest birth rates. Now, what's interesting is once you start looking into why Islam has the highest birth rates, it's not something that makes you think that Islam must be true. The reason is in Muslim countries, and even in non-Muslim countries where you have Muslim families in non-Muslim countries, the opportunities for women to have an education or careers is significantly lower than for non-Muslim groups. So basically, here in the West, a girl grows up, she completes her school and she goes out and gets a job, or she goes off to college and then starts a career or something like that. And there are all these things, but what you have is lots of women. Some women and girls end up starting a family 15, 16, 17, but generally they're in their 20s by the time they have their first kid. Some are in their 30s by the time they have their first child. Well, if there's nothing for you to do in society but be married off to someone and start a family, basically what you have in many Muslim areas is girls have their first kid at 13, and by the time they're 25, they have 7 or 8 children. And that just means your numbers explode. So when we see something like, hey, Islam is the fastest growing religion, this shows that it's true. The actual argument, if you look at what the study actually shows, is, wait a minute, you're telling me that Islam must be true because high birth rates due to not a lot for Muslim women to do in Muslim areas. I don't know many people who would take that as awesome proof that their religion is true. And so basically you take all the arguments that Muslims give, and again, there are more, but once you actually look into the evidence, you can show your Muslim friend some of the difficulties and why some of these arguments aren't very good. But with all of that said, that wouldn't show that your Muslim friend should believe in the gospel. And so that's why it's important to also be aware of their objections to Christianity. And lots of people don't want to get involved with reaching out to Muslims because they think Muslims have all these hundreds and hundreds of objections and so on. That's false. Muslims have about 6 objections, and we'll be looking at those in the next session. So if you're here for that, then guess what? You'll be fine for 99% of the conversations you will ever have with Muslims, because most of the objections they give are very easy to answer.